For therapy, reach out to CatholicHealingInstitute.com. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Mary, Mother of Healing, pray for us, amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Today in the Catholic Healing series, I'm presenting my talk on healing anxiety, actually managing it. If you enjoy this talk, please check out the other articles and videos in the series. It is the Catholic Healing series. God bless. These are anxious times, and there are a lot of things going on in the world today that can lead to anxiety. There are natural disasters, broken relationships, financial struggles, health issues, all kinds of things going on in society and the culture. And of course, internally, a lot of the time, what is going on with us can cause anxiety, and adjusting that can actually be a key part of solving the issue of managing it. Another really important thing is to take a look at the type of anxiety that a person is struggling with, and then proceed from there with the skills and the tools that are required to manage it effectively. But first, we will begin by exploring some of the key thinkers today and how they are impacting the field. I've had the pleasure of studying how to help people manage anxiety under Kimberly Morrow and Elizabeth DuPont Spencer in terms of what they're like. They're enthusiastic, they're upbeat, they're detail-oriented, they're systematic, they're collaborative. My wife and I, people often marry their opposite. My wife and I are a great example of that. In a lot of ways, I'm a free spirit. I like to play it loose. My wife, she likes a lot more structure. There's a fair amount on the laxity side for me, and on her side, maybe things more on the side of rigidity. What my wife likes to say is she really likes structured fun. Well, I think we could absolutely say that of Kimberly Morrow and Elizabeth DuPont Spencer. They like structured fun. As a matter of fact, they describe a lot of what they do with people as an experiment. There's this spirit of experiment that they will figure out what type of anxiety someone is struggling with, and then they'll collaborate with them on developing different skills and kind of trying things out to manage the anxiety. And in a lot of ways, it's a healthy experiment. There's a sense of fun, there's a sense of adventure, and they celebrate victories when they work with people. And at the same time, they're kind of like coaches. They're always pushing. You know, they'll celebrate that big victory, and then they'll say, okay, now would you like to try something that's the next step, right? And what they're doing is they're just walking with people and walking with people until people really reach that point where they're at a very good level of effectiveness at managing the anxiety. There are a few underlying principles that they really believe in when it comes to anxiety, and those are really important. One thing about anxiety is it's an essential part of living, and anxiety, in fact, unites us. We all need to manage anxiety. Another thing that's really important is that distraction doesn't work. One of the first things that Morrow and DuPont Spencer will do with people is they'll sit in session. They do face-to-face sessions. In the first session, they'll have an atomic warhead candy, and they'll give the client an atomic warhead candy. And they're both sucking on it, and they have a conversation about why they're having an atomic warhead candy. And where that ends up is that anxiety is a lot like having an atomic warhead candy, that at first it's really overpowering and it's really, really difficult to bear. But if you're able to sit with it, it dissipates. And that's a really pertinent analogy. Another story that Kimberly Morrow loves to tell is a story of how she did an anxiety management presentation at a company. And the CEO was there with his leadership team, and she dumped out all of the various props for her demonstration in the middle of the conference table. And she said to them, "Oh, leave those there. We'll be using those in the demonstration." And the CEO, either missing that or perhaps being a little mischievous and desiring to play around with some of the props before the presentation, picked up a finger trap. It's this paper finger trap, looks like a cylinder. And he put his fingers in both sides of the finger trap. And if you're familiar with how they work, what then happened was his fingers got stuck. He tried to pull them back apart, and they were stuck in there in that paper finger trap. Everyone else around the conference table had been caught up in their own discussion, and they started to notice, oh, there's the CEO having a tough time pulling his fingers out of the finger trap. And people start snickering and giving him a tough time, right? And he just tries to pull his fingers apart harder and harder. And again, if you know finger traps, the harder he pulled his fingers apart, the more stuck he was. The best way to get your fingers out of a finger trap, which Kimberly Morrow very mercifully showed the CEO, is that you want to push your fingers inward and twist, and then they come out of the finger trap. Again, a great analogy for anxiety. Struggling against it, this wrestling with it, leads to getting stuck in it. And in the world of ADHD, there's a saying that you want to go from being your ADHD to managing your ADHD. And that's true a lot of the time in the world of anxiety. You want to go from being your anxiety to managing your anxiety. And a lot of the time, the key to that is changing your relationship with anxiety. We don't want distraction on the one end. And on the other end, we don't want kind of wrestling with it that can lead to thought spirals. Instead, we want this healthy acknowledgement that the anxiety is there, making space for the anxiety, allowing the anxiety to have a sit and a visit until it decides that it's been enough time. And then it can say, well, I've had a good visit, and it can kind of wander away. And that is the true irony of anxiety, which is that to effectively manage it, what you really need to do is nothing. All right. I have a lot more coming, though, on all the different types of anxiety. And depending on the type, there can be very different tools for addressing that. So more on that in just one moment. Before I talk about healing anxiety, well, actually managing it, and offer a wide range of tools, I do want to make it clear that everything I offer here is not medical, psychological, or mental health advice or any kind of advice. It doesn't constitute any of these things, not medical, mental health, psychological advice, or any other kind of advice. I don't guarantee anything. Hopefully these tools are helpful. They've been helpful to many people, but I don't guarantee anything. I do have my own therapy practice. I would love to work with people in the therapy practice. Other than that, I don't have any affiliations. I don't have any product that I'm promoting. So just want to make all of that clear up front. The first thing that I'm going to discuss are phobias. And phobias are very trigger oriented. They are intense moments of fear or panic surrounding various trigger situations. And these are different examples of trigger situations. Being around an animal, a natural environmental event, being around something with blood, injection, injury, any of a number of situational moments, like being in a situation where you're in a high height, or you're riding on an elevator, or you're riding on an airplane. Sometimes people have an intense phobia about driving over bridges. That's a common one that I hear about. So those are just some examples of places where phobia can arise and be triggered. The real key to overcoming this phobic anxiety is exposure therapy. And I'm going to talk about how to do graded exposure here. When we say graded exposure, we mean grades just like grades in school. You graduate first grade, you go to the second grade, you graduate second grade, you go to third grade, and so on. It's a graded exposure. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a scale, first of all, surrounding anxiety. It's a SUDS scale. That's SUDS, a SUDS scale. And it stands for Subjective Units of Distress Scale. And you can do that from 1 to 10 in terms of the numbers that are involved in the ranking, or 1 to 100. But the way it works is this. A person can list different things that are stressful to them. I'll give you an example involving a phobia. Let's say you're afraid of spiders. Well, a person might become anxious when they think of a spider. They might become anxious when they talk about a spider. They might be anxious when they see a spider in a room that they're in, or maybe even see video of a spider. Then they might be even more distressed if they see a spider in the room they're in. And they might be really distressed if they're near the spider in the room that they're in. With a SUDS scale, the person can give each of those situations a number score. And what you can do is give each of those situations a number score, and then arrange things in what we call a hierarchy. You're going to have the thing with the lowest number that distresses you the least at the bottom, then the second lowest, then the third lowest, and then it keeps going all the way up to the thing that has the highest number that causes the most distress. And what you're going to do in a graded exposure is you're going to start out just one exposure per day at the most. And for example, where you start easy, right? The idea is in a graded exposure, you start with the easy stuff, you do it well, and you gradually work your way up to the hard stuff. So, for example, you might start on day 1 by looking at a picture of a spider. That's going to trigger you. And what you're going to focus on is getting a non-triggered response to that trigger image, that image of the spider. A great way to achieve that is with muscular relaxation. There's what's called interoception. And interoception is a great process where a person is using muscular relaxation to get the brain out of a state of hyperarousal. That's fight or flight mode. So when you're triggered and you're really anxious, your brain's in fight or flight mode. And if you can have your muscles be relaxed for 30 seconds or more, then it's like flipping an off switch on that hyperarousal. A great way to do that is to sit in a hardback chair with your feet flat on the floor, back up against the back of the chair, and then just let all your muscles go limp. We call that the noodle. And what you want to do is stay totally limp for about 30 seconds. Focus on any area in your body in particular that had been really tense. And that really helps people to ground. Other good things that can really help people flip the off switch on hyperarousal are calling a friend. A social connection can really help flip the off switch on hyperarousal. And another great one for Catholics is prayer. We can have a moment of deep meditative prayer with God and really calm that hyperarousal. So what you want to do is you want to stay with that exposure of looking at the image of a spider for maybe 2 or 3 days, let's say. But each day when you get triggered, to focus on trying to calm the trigger response faster and faster, eventually to the point where you might not even get a trigger response in the first place. That's real victory. So you could look at that picture of the spider and you're not having a trigger response to it. Then you're ready to graduate to the next level the next day. For example, that might be watching a video of a spider, right? And same thing. You're going to get really triggered again. You're going to focus on getting that non-triggered response, calming that hyperarousal. You do it enough and suddenly you're not getting a trigger response. Then maybe you move to being in the same room as a spider, right? And maybe even getting close to the spider. Focus on getting the non-triggered response. And that's the magic of graded exposure, that if we do this in grades, we're getting more and more competent at giving ourselves non-trigger responses and even calming ourselves when triggered, to the point at which we're in the highest level of trigger, and you can either get yourself to where you're not getting triggered or where you're really good at calming that trigger response. Another important thing, once the trigger response is calm, is to take a look at negative thoughts and to identify exactly what those are. Whether that's an image of a spider coming and biting you and crawling all over you, or the thought, oh, that spider might bite you and it might kill you. Whatever that distressing thought is, to be aware of it and to even almost develop a sense of peace with the fact that it's there, to not wrestle with it. Remember, when it comes to anxiety, a lot of the time the solution is to do nothing, right? So to not wrestle with that thought, but instead to focus on relaxation, that it's there, and you can focus on being relaxed. And over time, you can even focus yourself on almost refocusing on positive activities or more enjoyable things that you could be doing. So we have taken a look at managing phobias. On to the next type of anxiety. Now I'm going to talk about OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. And Obsessive Compulsive Disorder has to do with intrusive thoughts. There are these thoughts that arise in the unconscious mind. They're sent up to the conscious mind, up to the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain. And what happens is this process called fusion. And in this process, it's literally like someone takes a problem thought that causes a lot of anxiety and welds it right to the conscious mind. And that's the nature of the intrusive thought, that obsessive thought. And then a lot of the time, in an effort to detach that thought from the conscious mind, people will engage in compulsive behaviors. So that's the obsessive and then the compulsive of OCD. And to be fully diagnosable in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual that we use, you have to spend over an hour a day with obsessions and compulsions. But of course, even on the non-diagnosable level, there are a lot of people who have these symptoms, and it's very distressing. So what to do about the issue? Well, exposure therapy, again, is very, very helpful. So if these thoughts, a lot of the time intrusive thoughts have themes. So if they have a theme around anything that you can expose yourself to, you can do the same thing that you would do with a phobia. You can have that SUD scale and identify a low stress exposure, kind of mid stress, and then high stress exposures, and gradually work your way up that ladder, exposing yourself to whatever the theme is of the intrusive thoughts. And of course, a person's going to get triggered every time they have an exposure situation, and to focus on that non-trigger response again. However, there are some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that are also very effective in use against OCD. One of those is called diffusion. You may remember that when a problem thought comes up to the prefrontal cortex, that conscious mind, it gets welded there and stuck there in this process called fusion. And the answer is diffusion, to literally detach from problem thoughts. Good exercises for doing that can include saying the thought out loud, thanking your mind. So you can say, oh, thanks for sharing that problem thought, mind. I'm going to refocus on something else right now. It can even be just noticing, we say, using the word noticing. So instead of thinking, oh, I'm having this intrusive thought, the most common intrusive OCD thought among devout Catholic women is this intrusive thought about the fact that they were called to be a religious sister, even though they weren't called to be a religious sister. And I know that may sound unusual, but intrusive thoughts are unusual. And so let's say that's the issue. So this intrusive thought comes in, oh, you were actually called to be a religious sister. One thing you can do, instead of just saying, oh my goodness, am I a religious sister? Which I've heard this in session. You know, a lot of women will say, oh, am I one? Right? They won't even say religious sister because so much anxiety is tied to the word religious sister. They'll say, am I one? Instead of having this, oh, am I one response, a person can say, I'm noticing that I'm having this thought that's telling me that I'm a religious sister, right? You can even say, I'm noticing that there's a lot of anxiety tied to that thought. And already we're creating a lot of distance between the person and the thought. And from there, the person can say, well, thanks for sharing, mind. You know, I can't be certain. And I think I'm just going to focus on enjoying my prayer time right now, right? And a lot of the time with OCD, there's this desire for certainty. And certainty is the enemy when it comes to OCD. It's so important to remember that it's often good to say, you know, I can't be certain. So I'm going to let this sit and I'm going to focus on something positive right now. Another really helpful thing, this is from Jeffrey Schwartz, and his great work was Brain Lock. Schwartz really favors diminishing the importance of OCD thoughts. So OCD thoughts, a lot of the time, they're like the wizard in The Wizard of Oz. He blows himself up into this giant green smoke monster, but when you go around and you pull back the curtain behind it, he's just this cowardly little man. Intrusive thoughts are like that. They blow themselves up into these big, scary things. But if you take a look at them, they're just thoughts. You could say, oh, it's just thoughts. It's just my OCD. Diminish the importance of those thoughts. Shrink them down so that they're more bearable. And then let them sit. Just make room for them and let them sit. So a lot can be done with OCD that is really, really effective. And it can even be good toward the tail end of things to identify the positive thought, the positive activity, and move forward and really live your life. You know, a lot of people with OCD have told me, OCD, it almost always gets triggered in the best moments. And if a person's not careful, OCD will steal the best moments of a person's life. And instead, it's much better to say, you know what, it's not me, it's just my OCD. The thoughts aren't that important. I can't be certain. I'm going to let them sit, and I'm going to enjoy my life. In the Bible even, we see it says to be fully alive. Yes, I'm not going to let OCD ruin the best moments of my life. And instead, I'm going to choose to live fully alive. Panic disorder is unique in the world of anxiety in that it can be very genetic. It often runs in families, and it can be brought on by a lot of the same things that bring on seizures. Different things like bright lights can trigger panic attacks in some people, various stimuli. For some people, when baseline anxiety gets too high, let's say you're above average stressed for a week or two, that can trigger panic attacks. And panic disorder is intense anxiety and fear accompanied by various physical and cognitive symptoms. A lot of those include laryngeal spasms. That's a tightening of the muscles around the larynx that makes it tough to breathe. People have very fast heart rate. It feels like they're having a heart attack. They might have dizziness, lightheadedness, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like they're going to pass out, feeling like they're going to die. Even it can be a very intense experience. And just a couple quick notes. One is panic attacks can be caused by trauma, but if you're experiencing panic attacks caused by trauma, you'll get from my talk here some helpful tips for managing the panic attack. But it will be really helpful to check out my talk on healing trauma because there's a lot of trauma-specific stuff if trauma is causing the panic disorder. But a lot of the time it's genetic. It runs in the family. That's where it comes from. Step one is always to consult a doctor first. And I never want to be that therapist who's working with somebody and we're working on managing anxiety around panic attacks, and then they drop dead of a heart attack, right? That would be awful. In heart attacks and heart issues are just one example of things that cause similar symptoms to panic attacks. There can be issues with the thyroid, with the liver, so many different places in the body. So first, a person needs to see a medical doctor and rule out anything physiological that may be going on that's either causing panic attacks or that mimics them. And then after that, one of the key things is to be aware that a panic attack is a panic attack. Kimberly Morrow, who I learned from, who could be the best for dealing with anxiety, she struggles with panic attacks. She's always had them. I guess I could say she has struggled in the past. Now she manages them effectively. And one of the key ways she does that is she's aware that a panic attack is a panic attack. And she tells herself when it onsets, you know, it feels like I'm having a heart attack or like I'm going to pass out. But my theory is that this is a panic attack. And if it is, I'm going to test that. In about 20 minutes, it should really start to dissipate. I'm going to try and continue normal activity for that period of time. Another effective thing people can do is really have a routine that they do. So for example, some people really like to be seated during a panic attack. Some people like to be laying down. It can be very helpful to do different things that help the senses get activated. So having a starburst or gum around and actually chewing that, putting that in the mouth, tasting it, that can be very grounding, very helpful. Using the olfactory, the sense of smell, is very helpful, especially with lavender. So some people will carry around essential oils in a little vial as a keychain, and they'll sniff them during panic attacks, or they'll have a lavender plant around and sniff that during a panic attack. Muscular relaxation can be very helpful. Grounding exercises, taking a look around in the room, counting different things in the room, very, very helpful. Farther down your progression, it is helpful to have deep breathing. I wouldn't lead with deep breathing. I lead with grounding instead. That's more likely to flip the off switch on a lot of the hyperarousal that's going on in the brain, that fight or flight mode. But once you've done some of that, it can be helpful to breathe deeply. Of course, as Catholics, it can be helpful to pray as well. If there are other people who love you, who are in your life, who are around a lot of the time during panic attacks, working out something of a co-regulation routine with them. That'd be a routine where they really help you ground and kind of process through that panic attack. That can be really helpful. Again, you can see with panic attacks that it's not avoiding the panic attack. It's not treating the panic attack like it's the end of the world, but it's developing that healthy sense of relationship with the panic attacks and with the anxiety. That is the difference that makes the difference now I'm going to talk about managing generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety is very interesting in that in a lot of the other different types of anxiety, there are often triggers, and there are these moments where anxiety spikes up really, really high. With generalized anxiety disorder, a lot of the problem is baseline anxiety. So again, it's kind of this sense of not being triggered in any given moment throughout the day, but that throughout the day, a person, let's say on a scale from 1 to 10 of anxiety, with 1 being totally calm, 10 being panic attack, let's say the average person walks around and maybe they're at about a 4 or a 5 in anxiety throughout the day. You know, we all get rushed, we all get a little stressed. We can maybe taper down to about a 3. 3 is actually pretty optimal in anxiety for most of us. And then we're going to contrast that with somebody with generalized anxiety disorder. Someone with generalized anxiety disorder, you know, as opposed to running at about, optimally at a 3, maybe moving up to a 5, that person with generalized anxiety disorder might start at 5 and they might drift all the way up to maybe about a 6.5. And that actually makes a big difference when it comes to anxiety. When somebody hits a 7, that's where things can really start to feel like they're getting out of control. We call 7 the tipping point. And so this person, we say, with generalized anxiety disorder is always living life just one straw away from breaking the camel's back, right? So let's say circumstances get a little more difficult even. Well, then that anxiety can start getting really out of control. And even after a tough moment goes past, things just don't go back down to the level that they do for most of us. And this puts a real strain on the system for someone with generalized anxiety disorder. You know, an interesting thing about anxiety is there can be positives to it. People with OCD, for example, are great at focusing on things. People with generalized anxiety disorder are great at planning. They're rarely procrastinators because they look to the future and they feel anxious, and they actually feel a lot better if they build a plan, if they get working on things right away. They get a little bit of a sense of control. It's not all bad, but still, over time, they're living too stressed. They aren't feeling free enough to enjoy the present moment. Something needs to be done about it. So good things to do are cognitive behavioral therapy, being aware of your thoughts. You know, I worked under Greg Popcak for a long time, and he always says that our thoughts are like the soundtrack for our lives. That we go to the store, we go to the library, we go home, and in the background, just like the soundtrack of a movie, just like that music is running in the background in a movie, our thoughts are running in the background in our lives. And a lot of the time our thoughts are driving us and we're not even aware of what they are. So it can be really helpful to identify what some of those thoughts are. And are those thoughts causing us anxiety? Well, what might be a better thought to focus on? A person can ask, right? Or is it good even for a person to say, I'm acknowledging that this thought is here and I'm going to make space for it. I often encourage people to picture a thought box in their mind, a feeling box in their body, to make space for it. Let the thought, let that feeling of anxiety just sit in there. One of the biggest things people can do for generalized anxiety disorder is postponing, because common generalized anxiety disorder thoughts are what if thoughts. They think, well, what if blank terrible thing happens on Friday? Well, if blank terrible thing is going to happen on Friday and today it's Monday, well, the thought will say to a person, you know what, you should do this really rash action right now so you're ready for that crazy potential thing that could happen on Friday. And instead of going and doing it in the moment, it's good to postpone. It's good to say, you know what? It's Monday. The thing I'm worried about is on Friday, and it's only a potential thing. And so if it's Wednesday and I still think it's good to take this action that my mind is telling me to take, then I'll take it on Wednesday. But I'm going to wait 2 days, right? You're postponing it. And guess what happens when Wednesday rolls around? Just about never is it a good idea to do that rash, crazy action based on some potential thing that could happen on Friday. So postponing is a real blessing. Generalized anxiety is a great concept to think of in the world of anxiety in terms of harnessing good things that can come from it. That anxiety can even give people a little bit of energy, a little bit of extra focus, the ability to plan, and then you want to minimize the downside of it, that it can lead to people being preoccupied or taking rash actions. And a lot of the time, if a person can really focus on accentuating good and really kind of limiting what's going on the negative side of the equation, life improves significantly. Now I'm going to talk about medical anxiety, also called illness anxiety disorder in the current diagnostic manual. Previously, it had been called hypochondria, and it's excessive and persistent worry about having or developing a serious illness. Medical anxiety can result from trauma, especially childhood trauma. There's something in repetitive childhood trauma that sends the message to people, you are sick. There's something wrong with you and you are sick. And that can actually become somaticized, soma, as in of the body, somaticized, and it can actually become this preoccupation with actual physical illness. So there's this sense of, oh, you are sick. This message is sent when someone's young, emotionally, and as a human being. But the unconscious mind really has a way of converting that into this concern about the physical. So I do have my my talk on healing trauma. May be helpful for people with medical anxiety to check out, because that comes into play a lot. Another really noteworthy thing with medical anxiety is that it can result from disconnection to other human beings. A lot of the time when it first comes on the scene are places in a person's life where they're not that connected to other people. And even in the here and now, when managing it, it can really help to connect well with other people. And another thing I always warn against is that the apex of medical anxiety, when it's really, really getting out of control, is when people are going out on the internet and researching and researching and researching. And I can tell you, Dr. Google, he's a character. He almost always tells you you're gonna die. And that's not good for anxiety. And neither is just researching for hours. So don't do that. If you have medical anxiety, if it's trying to drive you to research, say, nope, nope, nope. I'm gonna detach from this urge. I'm gonna try and calm the hyperarousal that's going on, this sense of fight or flight mode, and I'm not going to research and research and research. A great way to do that is muscular relaxation. Another big thing I mentioned is social connection. Reach out to somebody instead of researching and researching and researching. And of course, you can pray, right? Another key thing is cognitive behavioral therapy. Being aware of what those thoughts are that you're having around medical anxiety. Have you had those thoughts in the past? It can be good to get almost a little Socratic with yourself. Socrates would always have these dialogues where he'd question, right? And so it's good to almost question it. Well, in the past, have I had this thought? Yes. In the past, when I had this thought and I had all that anxiety and I was preoccupied, did anything bad come of it? No. How often did that happen? Wow, it seems like that's been happening for most of my life, right? Oh, okay. Well, maybe I really need to detach from this thought. Maybe I need to say it out loud. Maybe I need to think my mind. Maybe I need to say, it's just my medical anxiety. Some people even draw pictures of their medical anxiety. They give it a name, right? Because it's almost like this character in people's minds that tells them terrible things, right? Terrible things that a friend would never say to you. OCD is like that too. You can do that with OCD, right? You would never talk to a friend the way medical anxiety talks to you. You would never talk to a friend the way OCD talks to you, right? Like, can you imagine a friend being like, oh yeah, you had a cough today. I bet it's because you have some kind of a throat or mouth cancer and you're going to die, right? You wouldn't say that to a friend, right? That's what medical anxiety says to people. With OCD, OCD will say to a person, we'll take the women who are afraid of being a religious sister, right? It'll say, oh, yeah, you were definitely called to be a religious sister, and you'll be miserable doing it, but that'll make it even better, and you need to go do it. And otherwise, God will hate you, right? Like, you would never tell a friend that, but OCD will tell someone that, right? So it can be helpful to draw a picture of it, to give it a name, and say, that's just blank, whatever name you gave it, and really refocus away from it. Now, if the medical anxiety did result from trauma, I'm going to take a brief look at one of my favorite methodologies. There's going to be a lot of deeper stuff in this on my talks on healing shame and healing trauma. But my favorite methodology is internal family systems. And that was developed by the great Richard Schwartz. I won't give my full breakdown of the theory, but what I will say is it breaks the self down into parts. And we even speak of ourselves in terms of parts. For example, I might say, well, part of me really wants to have ice cream, but part of me says, no, don't do it, Tom, you're on a diet, right? That's an example of two parts of me, not just talking to each other, but having a disagreement. And there are two key parts of the self in medical anxiety that we take a look at. So one is the wounded self, and the wounded self we say is exiled. Often we're wounded when we're younger emotionally, and that wounded self is sent away from the rest of the internal family system, carrying negative emotions to make difficult circumstances bearable. And that's a great coping mechanism early on. It's just that it really helps over time to unburden from that negative emotion and have that wounded self return to the rest of the internal family system and reintegrate. And there's another part of the self called the manager. I often call it the guardian because guarding is what it does. It keeps the self safe. And this part of the self is existing in extreme form, and that causes a lot of anxiety. So for example, in the case of medical anxiety, the guardian slash manager, that part of the self that keeps the self safe, it's concerned that you're going to get sick and die, right? And as a strategy, it develops hypervigilance and grasping for control, right? Trying to be certain. Again, certainty is the enemy, right? And so we need to develop alternative strategies, better strategies that cause less stress, right? And that would be accepting uncertainty, relinquishing control, surrendering, right? Trusting in God. You can pray the surrender novena, great Catholic novena there, right? So many good things with this relinquishing of control and not hunting after certainty. And this can really reduce stress level, right? And then we're going to look at that wounded exile, that wounded part of the self. A lot of the time it's carrying shame. Shame, feeling lonely, another big one with medical anxiety, right? Because so much of it has to do with being isolated in the first place. Feeling lonely, Feeling rejected, maybe feeling not good enough, feeling worthless. Absolutely. Could be anywhere in that neck of the woods. Those negative emotions need to be unburdened. A great way to do that is to go to prayer and give those emotions to Jesus. You can even picture yourself at the Mass. And when you're at the Mass, when they bring up the gifts, picture them bringing up your past experiences. And then when the priest transubstantiates the host, picture your past experiences being freed from negative emotion and being transformed. And then picture yourself receiving those past experiences back along with the Eucharist and being healed as Jesus joins with you, body and blood, soul and divinity, right? This is transcendent and a great way to heal medical anxiety. By the way, just a quick, if you're a psychology geek like me, quick, really kind of fun way to apply internal family systems to OCD. So much of OCD runs through that guardian/manager because it's a lot of that same concern about something. And then we've got the grasping for certainty, grasping for control, and the relinquishing of that, right? That can lead to healing. And sometimes it's really interesting. With OCD, a lot of the time, we don't expect a wounded part of the self to be behind that guardian manager. And sometimes there is one. I've heard different things with people where they were bullied, where parents insulted them, they were critical, they didn't even realize it, but it led to this extreme desire for certainty and control in so many of the OCD symptoms. Just a little nugget of thought there. It's very interesting. When we go through trauma, everything intensifies. That can include our anxiety, that can include our medical anxiety, and that can include our OCD. There are other helpful tools for managing anxiety, regardless of what type of anxiety a person struggles with. So I'm going to talk about wellness here. And for wellness, I'll start with diet. Having a good diet relative to gut health is really, really important. There's growing evidence for what's called the gut-brain axis. I'm certainly a believer in it. And the theory of the gut-brain axis goes like this, that when a person eats healthy, has a healthy gut, it generates lots of serotonin. That serotonin goes up to the brain and helps calm the brain. And that's one of the great things that serotonin does. And that brain that's happy because of the serotonin through the nervous system sends messages back down to the gut that things are going pretty well. And the happy gut produces more serotonin. More serotonin goes up to the brain's even happier, sends another positive message down to the gut. And it's this positive feedback loop. Well, the same can happen on the negative side of things, that if the gut gets thrown way off, it doesn't produce enough serotonin, and then not enough serotonin goes up to the brain gets distressed and anxious, sends a message down to the gut, throws the gut off more, produces less serotonin goes to the brain's more distressed, sends another message that's negative back down to the gut, right? So this gut-brain axis can either become a really positive feedback loop or a really negative feedback loop. These are some of the things that you can add to your diet that I consume myself that are all food-based, just about. And I've found them to be really great. Now, everybody has to figure out things for themselves. I don't know what any individual person's needs are or anything, so I'll always offer that caveat. But I will say that I have found the gut supplements that I take to be very helpful for anxiety. And when they do blood tests on me, they tell me I have unicorn blood. They're very good for overall health as well. So a lot of this comes out of the Nemechek protocol. He originally developed that, I believe, for autism, but it's great for anxiety and overall wellness too. And what's included in it is daily multivitamin, I really like to add in some calcium and magnesium as well. And then a spoon of fish oil daily. I get lots of good omegas from that, right? Great for the brain, great for the blood. So many good things. Spoonful of olive oil, that'd be an extra virgin olive oil. And, very, very healthy as well. And then yogurt, kefir, kombucha, or probiotic supplement. And that, again, just great. You get that good healthy bacteria and they're great for the gut. And then at least 4 to 6 servings of fruits and vegetables daily. And I'm usually at 6 or above. And that is so good for gut health, so good for overall health, and can be very, very good for mental health. Moving on, sleep. With sleep, it's really good to be early to bed, early to rise, aim for about 8 hours of sleep on average. Everybody has an optimal level of sleep that may be slightly different, but it's usually right around 8 hours. And we're looking for something where we're moving with the sun. There have been lots of studies on that. So if we're going to bed around 10, waking up around 6 a.m., that's just about optimal. You could do 9 to 5, something like that. If you're having issues with sleep, it's good to practice good sleep hygiene. That's involving different things with temperature. You always want a slightly cooler sleep environment. You can have a weighted blanket, have a nice dark sleeping area. Don't look at screens, ideally within 3 hours of sleep, but if you can do it at least within 1 hour of sleep, read a book or something instead. Don't exercise near the time you sleep, but do exercise earlier in the day. All of that's good sleep hygiene. You can go even farther with that, where there is CBT type stuff, awareness stuff we can do around sleep, and you can actually track what you're doing to try and sleep better, and see what you're doing that's helping, and do more of that. See where there are issues. See if you can come up with solutions for those issues and obstacles. It can help to do visualizations as well, to have a calm place that you visit. You can, whatever your favorite place is, you picture yourself there for about 5 minutes, eyes shut, before bedtime. You can picture Jesus and Mary there and even talk to them. These are all things that can help improve sleep quality. Moving on, exercise. It's good to do something that's muscular. I'm a big fan, even if it's super light lifting for tone, maybe about 3 times a week. And then maybe something with cardio, maybe about 4 times a week. It's really, really good. It can be helpful to do integrative exercises. Good examples of that are soul core or Pilates. That can be really, really great for overall health. Great for the brain as well. Actually helps the brain to integrate. And then as Catholics, we had a 4th component. This is usually a triad: diet, sleep, exercise. We had prayer, right? There's a 4th element, prayer. I love to start the day with prayer. I strongly recommend it. I do prayer. I go right into my exercise. Can be very, very good. But really getting relational with God and going to prayer, sharing with God what's going on, even seeing if he has a word for you, right? About that anxiety, and a word of comfort, consolation, a word of calm. Sometimes medication is helpful when it comes to anxiety. It's really important to consult with a psychiatrist. I am not a prescribing professional, so I never prescribe. I always refer to a prescribing professional. I often refer to a psychiatrist. They just have that added specialized knowledge beyond a general practitioner of specific things that might be going on diagnostically. And then they have the insight into what might be the exact right medication to pair with things. Common meds that are prescribed around anxiety are SSRIs. That is going to be a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's basically going to increase serotonin levels in the brain. And there are also SNRIs. That's a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And that's going to work on norepinephrine levels in the brain. If anything, when it comes to outright anxiety, I do lean a little bit in the direction of SNRIs, just because norepinephrine does often come into the picture when anxiety is concerned. Again, though, I always defer to the prescribing professional. And these are key things to look for in a psychiatrist. And this is really important, I think. And I've seen it be a really important part of people's experiences, that it's so important to find the right psychiatrist. I encourage people to treat finding the right psychiatrist as a consumer experience. And I want people going in there, what I believe really makes for good criteria for a good psychiatrist is they're collaborative. There's someone who cares. There's someone who explains what they're seeing, who explains what they're prescribing and why. They're very conversational, right? And I encourage people to find that person. You often get that feeling in the gut, either, oh, this feels good, or no, it doesn't feel good. If it doesn't feel good, you might in the short term be stuck working with someone. But I encourage people to keep trying professionals, to keep shopping around, seeing if you can find that fit, because that fit is often the difference that makes the difference. In terms of prescription, what's going to happen is they're going to prescribe you, and it's usually at a low dose. You want to keep an eye out for bad side effects, especially early on. Examples of those would be things like facial twitching, extreme restlessness, extreme nausea, suicide ideation, things in that neck of the woods. And if any of those things show up, it is important to discontinue use immediately. Reach out again to that psychiatrist right away. And usually what will happen is they'll set a follow-up about 6 weeks out. For most SSRIs and SNRIs, it does take 6 weeks for sometimes any, and a lot of the time optimal effect of the medication to really kick in. So a lot of the time what they'll do is they'll offer you a low-level prescription. You take it for 6 weeks, you check in, you see how you're doing, and if things are going pretty well, but maybe the dose isn't quite high enough, then they're going to raise the dose. If things aren't going well, well, then they might change the med. They might take a look at changing directions at that time. And it's an ongoing relationship, which is why it's so important to have someone who's collaborative, who cares, who's competent, and who's really, really going to work with you over an extended period of time. It's not courage unless you're afraid. And I think that has a lot to do with why God allows fear and he allows anxiety, because when we overcome it, it is a prayer to him that is more powerful than any prayer we could offer with words. In the Bible, we see that it is fear, not hate, but fear that is the enemy of love. And perfect love casts out fear. If you need help in your process, please feel free to reach out to me. But regardless, know of prayers in my rosary and in my chaplet, that you may have graces from Mary, who is full of grace, to have the strength of God, to overcome fear, to manage anxiety effectively, and to live with courage. May Mary, the Mother of Courage, pray for us. Amen. For therapy, reach out to CatholicHealingInstitute.com.